Hello, yes. So today we are going to speak about cardiac diseases. Cardiac diseases are the conditions affecting the heart, and these are collectively known as heart diseases. Before we move on to the conditions, we'll just review the cardiac anatomy first. There are four chambers in the heart, mainly the right atrium, the left atrium, right ventricle, and the left ventricle. There are four valves, tricuspid valves between the right atrium, right ventricle, the pulmonary valve between the pulmonary artery and the right ventricle, the aortic valve between the aorta and the left ventricle, and the mitral valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Then the myocardium, or the muscle of the heart, is supplied by the coronary arteries, and the whole heart is surrounded by a structure which is called as the pericardial sac. So four chambers, two atria, two ventricles, atria separated by the atrial septum, ventricles separated by the ventricular septum, four valves, two semilunar, two atrioventricular, then the myocardium, which is the muscle of the heart, then there is pericardium and the blood vessels supplying the heart. So what I've done is I've tried to categorize all the conditions into the structures which are getting affected. So if the blood supply of the heart gets affected, then the diseases which are there are coronary artery disease, coronary heart disease, and ischemic heart disease. This can eventually lead to an emergency condition, which is myocardial infarction. The next, which is the muscle of the heart or the myocardium, when this gets affected, the condition known as cardiomyopathy, and it can eventually lead to CCF. Then the inflammatory conditions which affect the myocardium, myocarditis and infective endocarditis. Then the valves which get affected, mitral, tricuspid, aortic, and the pulmonary. It can uh, it can lead to problems in the valves because of regurgitation and the stenosis. Then there are septal defects, atrial septal defect and ventricular septal defects, and the pericardial diseases, namely pericarditis and effusion. So what I've done is I've categorized all these conditions into the parts or the structures of the heart which gets affected. So it's very easy for you to remember this. So the septum, it mostly the congenital heart defects are the defects which lead to the problems in the septum, especially the atrial septal defect and the ventricular septal defects. The blood supply of the heart, ischemic coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, coronary heart disease, valves, valvular heart disease, myocardium, cardiomyopathy, dilated hypertrophic and restrictive cardiomyopathy, inflammatory conditions which eventually lead to congestive cardiac failure. And then there is pericardium, pericarditis and pericardial effusion. So first we'll review the cardiac diseases: coronary artery disease, cardiomyopathy, inflammatory conditions, congenital heart defects, valvular heart disease, and the pericardial disease. So I've just jotted down all the diseases into one slide. Now we'll see the coronary artery disease first. It's the most common cause of the heart attack. Mostly it happens because of the restriction in the blood flow. Blood flow through the coronary arteries is obstructed. The coronary arteries supply the heart muscle. So when the blood supply to the heart muscle gets affected, it leads to coronary artery disease. It happens because of atheromatous plaque within the walls of the arteries, and the blood flow to the heart muscle is limited. One thing which is important to understand, that this coronary artery disease is preventable, and it eventually leads to coronary heart disease. So there is less blood supply and oxygen to the heart, which is myocardium, and in this what happens is the oxygen demand of the myocardium is more than the supply, and can get aggravated during exertion, and especially it can lead to chest pain, breathlessness, and other cardiac the symptoms of the heart disease. Now there's another terminology which is ischemic heart disease, the same as the coronary artery disease, and basically ischemia means less blood supply to a particular part. So if it is ischemic heart disease, there is less blood supply and oxygen to the heart muscle. So that's the same thing. So you don't need to get confused between different terminologies. Basically all these conditions, coronary artery disease, coronary heart disease, ischemic heart disease, are the conditions which happen because of the restriction of the blood supply to the myocardium or the heart muscle. Next is myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is a total block in the coronary arteries, and because of the block of the coronary arteries, the artery which supplies the myocardium or the heart muscle, it can get dead. The part of the heart which the coronary artery supply, if the artery is blocked, then it can lead to complete death of the part. And if the part of the heart which is supposed to pump is dead, it can eventually lead to failure of the heart. So there's a block in the coronary arteries leading to death of the heart muscle cells. Progression, it is basically a progression of the coronary artery disease or the ischemic heart disease, and can lead to death if untreated. Next, we'll see cardiomyopathies. Basically, myopathy means the disease of a muscle in which the muscle do not function properly. So cardiomyopathy is if the heart muscle does not function properly, it is called as the cardiomyopathy. It is a progressive condition and it is categorized into 4 categories. Also, there are more categories which are not covered over here. So most important types of cardiomyopathy are dilated cardiomyopathy, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, restrictive cardiomyopathy, and arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia. So dilated cardiomyopathy is the most common condition, and heart muscle is too weak to pump the blood efficiently. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the muscle cell enlargement happens and it can lead to a thick ventricular of the septum. So thickening of the ventricular or the septum leads to less amount of space left for the uh, blood to come to the ventricle. So if less blood supply is coming to the ventricle, eventually what happens is the blood cannot be pumped properly. So if the incoming of the blood is less, the outcoming or the cardiac output will definitely be less. So it can lead to failure of the heart. Next is restrictive cardiomyopathy. In this, what happens is the scar tissue replaces the normal heart tissue. The normal heart tissue, if it is there and if it is scarred, or if it is, let's say, replaced by fibrous tissue, then the muscle which is supposed to function, or the contraction of the muscle which is supposed to happen, it does not happen because of the scar tissue. So this is called as restrictive cardiomyopathy. Next is arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia. It's rare, leads to arrhythmia as the name suggests, and it is responsible for sudden cardiac arrest in athletes. So all these cardiomyopathies eventually lead to failure, or you can say CCF, congestive cardiac failure. Then next we'll see the inflammatory heart disease. Inflammatory heart disease mostly happens because of infection. Myocarditis, or the inflammation of the myocardium, happens mostly because of sarcoidosis and amyloidosis. Examples of inflammatory heart disease are infective endocarditis, rheumatic heart disease, etc. The next we'll see pericardial diseases. Pericarditis, or inflammation of the pericardium, is one of the disease of the covering of the heart. So also there is pericardial effusion. What happens in this effusion is there is collection of fluid in the pericardial sac. So what happens, because of the collection of the fluid, it tries to compress the heart. So when the heart has to relax during diastole, it cannot relax because of the continuous amount of pressure which is put because of the effusion. So it constricts the functioning of the myocardium, which can lead to failure again. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope it was useful for you. Thank you.